The topic for today is a somatic approach to healing pain patterns and chronic tension in the neck and shoulders. Just a super quick introduction. If you have not met me yet, my name is Liz Heffernan. I'm a yoga therapist and a yoga teacher. I'm also the founder and director of Soma Yoga Institute. Our approach to yoga includes an anatomy-informed alignment system to keep the body safe, very mindful vinyasa, and then variations to meet the needs of all bodies, aging bodies, injured students, pure beginners, and limited mobility. I'd like to talk a little bit about what is somatics, how it differs from yoga, and what its benefits are. And then, as mentioned, I have a nice 35-minute, 40-minute perhaps practice. And if you haven't done somatics before, somatics are gentle neuromuscular release techniques that are designed to reeducate your brain and realign your body so you can move about your day free of tension, free of aches, and free of pain. Okay, I want to talk about frozen shoulder. This is a situation that's happened to me in the past. It's something that has brought me great interest and also understanding of the shoulder joint. So a frozen shoulder, it can also be called adhesive capsulitis. And this is when your glenohumeral joint capsule becomes stiff or frozen. And it can cause an excruciating amount of pain. It can limit your range of motion. It can limit your activities of daily living to such an extent that it actually starts to impact your emotional state, and anxiety or depression can come from the hopelessness that you feel, especially when medical science isn't able to provide a quick fix or even a clear pathway towards healing. So the frozen shoulder is a restriction in the glenohumeral joint, and your glenohumeral joint is made up of your shoulder blade, the scapula, and your upper arm bone, the humerus. Sometimes scar tissue can form there, inflammation, maybe a lack of synovial fluid. Again, that joint just becomes stiff. The capsule loses its resiliency, and some even say possible adhesions begin to form inside the joint. So this can occur for about 2 to 5% of the population, so it is fairly common. It affects people in the age range of 35 to 65. It can occur in younger people too, especially those that are involved in sports, especially sports with overhand motions like volleyball or tennis. It does go through a couple different stages. There's the freezing stage where pain begins and range of motion becomes limited. And then the frozen stage, the pain might actually ease up a little bit in this stage, but range of motion becomes even more limited. And then there's what's called the thawing stage, where there's a gradual alleviation of the symptoms. And these stages can last months or even years. You can manage a frozen shoulder through surgical or non-surgical options. And some of the non-surgical options, it might be anti-inflammatory drugs, physical therapy, steroid injections into the joint, sometimes just injecting water into the joint, distension therapy, electrotherapy, where they put some electrical pulses into the problem area. And when we look to the scientific research, we see variable results and little evidence to support one of the treatments over the other. But what we do see in the scientific research is that gentle, natural movements has been shown perhaps to be the most effective treatment for frozen shoulder. And we'll open up some of those studies together this morning. When I was looking into the research today for this presentation, I wanted to share this article that I came across. It's from 2022, so very recent. It was published in the peer-reviewed journal BMC for Musculo Disorders, and it's called Living with a Frozen Shoulder, a Phenomenological Inquiry. And I really liked this because this is talking about the lived experience of somebody with a frozen shoulder. And the article is very interesting. You're welcome to read it. It provides insights and explains that the pain endured from frozen shoulder has actually profound impacts on physical health, on mental health. The loss of functioning results in a negative narrative, which then can contribute to an altered sense of self. The participants in the study use words to describe their pain as horrible, excruciating, debilitating, unbearable. The pain affected all facets of their life. It impacted their work, their sleep, their personal hygiene, their interpersonal relationships, and their feelings of independence. And the prolonged duration made it debilitating and demoralizing. Activities such as just getting dressed, shopping, it became very challenging. I'd like to share just a little bit of my personal story with this, my lived experience with a frozen shoulder. I suffered from a frozen shoulder in my 40s, and I was working at a very high stress desk job. Looking back at this, I did not really have healthy postural habits sitting at my desk. I spent a lot of time with rounded forward, a little excess kyphosis in the upper spine, with my mouse hand too far away from my body, and very tense in the neck and shoulders, partly because of the weight of the responsibility the job entailed. And then at night after work, I would show up to my yoga asana practice and build my yoga practice on top of these poor postural habits. So when we all do this, when we slump at the computer, that upper back rounds, we get the excess kyphosis and the forward head syndrome. The glenohumeral joint begins to round forward, the pectoral muscles get really tense, the trapezius and neck muscles become very tense. And then you think about that, and then coming to a vigorous yoga practice with chaturangas and up dogs and arm balances with poorly misaligned shoulders, I think this is what contributed. It compounded over time, and it resulted in my body as a frozen shoulder, which was excruciatingly painful. I couldn't lift my arm up overhead. I couldn't brush my hair, and it actually happened in my dominant arm, so my right arm. I couldn't brush my hair. I couldn't even put on a t-shirt. And at that time, since I was a yoga teacher, I was also fearful that I was going to no longer be able to teach yoga. So I went to see some general practitioners, physical therapists, chiropractors, acupuncturists. I tried everything, but I wasn't really seeing any results from what was being offered to me. And I knew I wanted to avoid surgery if at all possible. But then I came to the realization that I possess a deep underlying belief in the body's innate inner wisdom. And this belief is something I developed from decades of yoga practice. So I went to my mat, and rather than continuing to just move the arm and the shoulder into pain, I used the pain as a tool. And I developed a practice where I was moving the shoulder joint as much as possible, but without moving into pain. And when you can't lift your arm into flexion or extension or abduction, there's not that many yoga poses available to you. And this is where the somatics came in. And this is why somatics has been so instrumental in helping me heal from this disorder. And over the past decades, I've been working with people privately with frozen shoulder, and I've seen really wonderful results. So I'm very happy to be able to share this with you. I'm not going to go too deep into anatomy today because it's a pretty complex subject, but one thing that I would love to get across is that the shoulder complex is very complex and that it's actually composed of 3 joints plus what I call a false joint. So one joint, you have the head of the arm bone meeting the shoulder blade, the glenohumeral joint. You also have the acromion clavicular joints, the acromion process of your shoulder blade meeting your collarbone. So this is a joint here. and the sternoclavicular joint, where your breastbone and collarbone meet. So those are three joints that make up the shoulder. And then the false joint, what I say, is how the scapula actually meets the back body of the ribs. And so there's not really a bone-to-bone connection here, but there's a lot of muscular connections between those two. And if you see the rotator cuff, it's a ball and socket joint. It wasn't really designed for us to be weight bearing. It's much more designed for it to be a range of motion joint. If you look at the hip joint, the hip ball and socket has a very deep socket, and that creates more stability. And this has a very shallow socket, which creates less stability, but more range of motion. And so when we do a lot of weight bearing on this joint, the rotator cuff muscles need to be equal in flexibility and strength, as well as the muscles that stabilize your shoulder blade on the back body need to be equal in flexibility and strength. And sometimes our muscles get locked long in a certain positioning. Sometimes they get locked short, and then they aren't able to return to their natural range of motion. So I had a yoga teacher once share with me this idea that when this shoulder complex is functioning well, it's like a beautiful orchestra that makes such beautiful music. But when one or two things are just slightly out of place, it actually sounds like an orchestra with all of the instruments playing a different key. It's like the nails on the chalkboard. So there's a lot that goes on in the shoulder. I pulled out this study. This was a study of 77 patients with frozen shoulder, and it compared two groups. We had one group that was intensive stretching and physical therapy, and the other group was called supervised neglect. And this supervised neglect group just did exercises within comfortable range of motion. And 24 months after the start of the treatment, the supervised neglect group regained 89% of their shoulder function, while the intense stretching group regained 63% of their shoulder function. What this is saying perhaps is that performing exercises in comfortable range of motion might be a better therapy. Okay, so here's another study. This is the last one I'll present today, but this uncovered the role of chronic and involuntary muscle tension in frozen shoulder. They had 5 patients who were about to go into surgery to do the capsular release technique to alleviate the frozen shoulder, so through surgery. And what they did is they measured the range of motion in the patient's shoulder before they went under anesthesia and then after the anesthesia. And they found that in all 5 patients, there was significantly more range of motion when they were under anesthesia. And they saw increases in mobility from 44 degrees all the way up to 110 degrees. So the researchers in the study concluded that muscle stiffness or muscle guarding appears to be a very major factor to reduce the range of motion in frozen shoulder. So when we're in pain, we instinctively tighten up around that area in order to limit movement, in order to prevent further pain. That's just normal. And so this study and the previous study are pointing to perhaps this idea that gentle exercises that release chronically held muscle tension patterns might be a really wonderful practice. Okay. And this is what I did. I was dedicated to my own personal practice. I wanted to keep moving my body and my shoulder as much as possible, but not move into pain. And Somatics is just so perfect for this. As mentioned, they are gentle. They work with neuromuscular release, and they reeducate our brain. And this is a quote from Thomas Hanna. So Thomas Hanna is a very big influencer in the somatic movement. And he writes, "The field which studies the soma, namely the body perceived from within by first person perception." So what is somatics? It's a field that studies soma, the body perceived from within by first person perception. And so there's an aspect of somatics where we drop our awareness into the innate intelligence of our body, and we start to move and listen from that place. So somatics uses a technique where we engage the muscle and we just consciously feel the engagement of the muscle. We make the contraction strong enough so we can actually feel the muscle working. And then we release it as slow as possible to help the muscle remember what its natural relaxation point is. And then after that, then we just relax and notice. So a lot of somatics is just starting to pay close attention to the sensations of the body. Okay, so we can say that somatic exercises helps us improve mind-body connection. There's an idea that our body forgets. So we have amnesia. The exercises are there, they're designed for us to rewire our brain to help our brain remember. And we can move into this slide, might help out a lot. Sensory motor amnesia is when our brain forgets. We have a central nervous system, a brainstem, and the spinal cord, and then we have a peripheral nervous system, so all the nerves that extend out from there. And in the peripheral nervous system, we actually have two divisions, a sensory division, as well as a motor division. And the sensory division is about perception, feeling, sensation. Motor is about movement. So, you touch a hot stove, you feel that, that's your sensory division, and then removing your fingers from the hot stove is the motor. The motor division also has two units. It has the somatic nervous system, which is voluntary. So our muscles are under our voluntary control. And then we have the autonomic nervous system that's involuntary. So it's like your heartbeat. Your heart is beating all the time. You're not consciously thinking about that. What happens is when we repeat a pattern in our physical body is it becomes so hardwired in that it shifts from voluntary to involuntary. So if we're always crunching our shoulders up to our ears because we're feeling stressed out, after a while, the muscles just hold that pattern and that pattern becomes involuntary. So this is the sensory motor amnesia, and the somatic exercises are designed for us to rewire back to voluntary so we can teach the shoulder blades their positioning on the back. So another concept by Thomas Hanna is that you can't fix what you cannot feel. So a lot of the practice is just taking the time to slow everything down and pay attention with deep inquiry and listening. Then this practice really becomes a practice of conscious embodiment. We practice a lot mindfulness in our life. We sit on our meditation cushion and we do our practices, and we practice this idea of staying present with our mind, directing our mind. But when we also do that work, but we're present with ourselves physically, we become bodyful, consciously embodied. And that's a wonderful place to live. And we do that with loving kindness towards ourselves, of course. Okay, so we're going to do some practices now, and we're going to go into what I call this idea of pandiculation. So there'll be a voluntary contraction of a certain muscle group or a certain muscle, and we're going to direct the brain to pay attention to that sensation. Bring it there, and then the slow release. I like to think about the release in somatics as different than the release in yoga. So in yoga, sometimes you do a contraction and a release. So you inhale, lift the shoulder up, exhale, release the shoulder down. This is the inhale, lift the shoulder up, and then the slowest possible release that you can do, where you're moving so slow and you're actually so attentive to the muscle as it's releasing. You're feeling the muscle as it releases. And then you just allow it to come back into length and relaxation in its natural state. And then there's a pause. And in this pause, we can call it the somatic pause or the proprioceptive pause. That's when the brain has a chance to integrate and remember and return to healthier patterns.